Hey everyone, Captain Migraine here. I just wanted to show off the new and improved Cube Builder blueprint I've been working on. The Cube Builder blueprint is essentially just it's a quick way to prototype map creation. Uh, Instead of using BSP, I can basically just use static meshes for this, which for my particular game is actually way better than just using BSP due to collision related things, and also being able to kind of visualize what I want the final product to look like. So I found that BSP was not really good for that purpose, and so I created my own Cube Builder blueprint. And this is just an example map with some it's kind of like a ruler, so to speak, so you can visualize what's going on better. So let me go ahead and bring in the old blueprint that I created. So with this, I can click on these little widgets and then resize these to various increments. And what happens is the blueprint tries to choose the optimal mesh for the situation. So instead of just scaling the mesh to each of these increments, it'll actually switch between 20 different meshes. So basically, let me go ahead and move that there. And so if I drag this here, it'll switch to a 256 wide piece. And if I move this here, it'll switch to a 512 wide piece. And if I move this here, it'll switch to a 1024 wide piece. So this is really useful for creating maps very quickly. On top of that, once I've selected the length of piece that I want, I can then select this X widget, and then I can move that out, and then it will basically repeat each static mesh, and it'll choose a random rotation for each mesh so that it tries to obfuscate the pattern repetition. And so maybe it's not working right now because it looks like it shows the same one for each of these. Actually, no, it started randomizing right there. And so anyway, that just kind of obfuscates the random. It obfuscates the pattern repetition so that it doesn't look obvious or whatever. And so anyway, I ran into some problems with this mesh. I realized that there were times when I needed to choose a scale that was somewhere in between. So like if I wanted to choose 640 or 768, what I would have to do is I would have to manually scale this blueprint, which, as you can see, it did a pretty good job. It worked great for this particular situation. But if I wanted to choose a scale that was less than the halfway point, so in other words, like let's say 640, then at this point you start to see some obvious stretching going on in the static mesh, and that's because this is not the optimal length for this particular piece. Really, I should have chose the 512 length piece for this, and then it would look better in this particular situation. And so what I would have to do is I have to go back to the dimensions, scale that down, make sure it doesn't repeat, and then I would have to scale it back up, and then that starts to look a little bit better. It's still a little bit stretched, but it's not nearly as stretched. And so I found out that this was a rather encumbering process. It wasted a lot of time, and also it created collision issues as well. Apparently Unreal Engine 4 does not like it whenever you scale instanced static meshes, because depending on like the initial rotation of the mesh, that can influence the collision. So the collision can actually become incorrect, and all sorts of problems arise. And so anyway, this mesh, it was certainly useful for the time, but I realized that it was definitely causing some growing pains. And so I've recreated the blueprint from scratch, and let me go ahead and just line this up so that it's where it needs to be. So here is the brand new blueprint that I created. It looks exactly the same, and the end result is pretty much the same. The difference is I've simplified things quite a bit. There are fewer widgets that you can click on, and now it actually scales. Let me go ahead and turn off the grid snapping so you can see the example a little bit better. But now it actually scales perfectly, and I don't have to scale the whole blueprint. I can just grab this dimensions widget, and then it'll automatically scale the static mesh to exactly where it needs to go. On top of that, it chooses the optimal mesh for the situation. So as it gets closer to the 512 mark, it switches to the 512 width mesh, and as it gets closer to the 256 mark, it switches to the 256 mesh. So it's fairly intelligent with the way it works. In total, this can actually switch between 20 different meshes. So it can start from the 128, switch to the 256, switch to the 512, and then finally switch to the 1024. This also works in the y-axis. Same thing happens here, so it switches between all the different meshes in the y-axis, and it also switches between all the meshes in the z-axis as well. So in total there are 20 meshes that it switches between, and it will basically rotate meshes as needed. And so anyway, one of the other cool things about this is that if I go into the details here, I have a Boolean that I have that's basically just for debugging purposes. What I've done is I've created a I wouldn't say complicated, but it's fairly sophisticated the way it determines which mesh should be chosen for each situation. But if I uncheck this box in here that says use nearly equal for mesh determine, what happens is now it will only switch to the next mesh on the line exactly. And this is like the default behavior, and obviously this is not good because in this situation, if it's less than 256, then it really stretches that mesh out. And then if it's less than 128, well, there's nothing less than 128, so it doesn't switch to anything. But so as soon as it hits 256, it switches to the 256 mesh, and then right before it gets to the 512, it's really stretched out and really awkward looking. And then same thing, once it gets to the 1024 point, it's really stretched out and really awkward looking. And so anyway, this checkbox in here, I added this, and so what it does is it just kind of intelligently picks the midpoint between these. So right about here, I think this is 768 if my math serves me correct. Yeah, so at the 768 point, it will actually switch to the next mesh. And that just tries to alleviate the stretching as much as possible. And so again, this works in every single axis, the y-axis and the z-axis. And so I also have repeating working, so let me go ahead and drag this out. So yeah, depending on wherever you put this dimensions thing, it will try to fill that space with as many meshes as possible. And pretty much exactly as you would expect. So 128, it'll try to repeat that mesh, and it will also randomize the rotation to try and obfuscate the pattern repetition. And I believe I have a checkbox in here, somewhere in here. Randomize rotations. So yeah, if I uncheck that, in this particular instance, okay, so you can see a little scratch here. There's the same exact scratch, and so you can see how the pattern repetition is very obvious. There's the same exact scratch on every single piece, and so by just check marking that randomized rotation, it rotates the mesh in the basically the allowed axes. So if it can rotate in the x-axis, it'll rotate 90 degrees or 180 degrees in the x-axis. If it can rotate in the y-axis, then it'll rotate 90 or 180. And the same thing with the z. If it can rotate in the z-axis, it will rotate 90 or 180 degrees in the z-axis. And you end up with a really good result. And so what this means is you can very quickly prototype a map using this blueprint. And let me just go ahead and open up my example map. Don't save that. Turn on grid snapping. And so here's just an example of the map. I've changed over every single cube to the brand new cube builder blueprint that I rewrote from scratch. And so you can see how you can construct very intricate looking maps using this cube builder blueprint. Anyway, thanks for watching.